Hello, everybody. This is Douglas Reeves, broadcasting today from Philadelphia, even though my home is Boston. But you can't get to Boston now because of the latest snowstorm that we have. I am very proud to introduce my colleague, Alexandra Guilamo, and I'm going to tell you more about her in a moment. Our subject this afternoon is ELL, and we're going to have this webinar recorded so that if you or your colleagues want to be able to listen to this and refer to it, you have every opportunity to do so. Moreover, Alexandra and I are both very happy to be able to talk to you and follow up, because we believe that professional development is not a one-off event, but something that is designed to be continuous. So we're very grateful that we have such a large audience this afternoon from around the world. Let me tell you a few things about Alexandra before I introduce her. As a language learner herself, Alexandra has spent the last 20 years helping students who are culturally and linguistically diverse to achieve academic success. Alexandra is a former teacher, academic coach, elementary school principal, district level director in highly diverse urban and suburban districts. This wide range of experiences and roles equips her to provide a unique lens and ability to advise educators and leaders in achieving equitable access to high quality education for all students. Alexandra now facilitates a wide range of coaching, principal training, school-wide professional development, and strategic school support in order to drive ELL student equity, access, and achievement. Alexandra is also an author and recognized expert in effective systems and practices for culturally and linguistically diverse students in dual language, bilingual, and other language learner programs. I am so happy to introduce my colleague, Alexandra. So please proceed.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to be joining you this afternoon for this webinar about high-impact instruction for English language learners. Before we get started, I do want to make sure that everybody's audio is working and that the sound is coming through just clear. If you can, just go ahead and type in the chat box if you're able to hear us all right. We would greatly appreciate it before we move forward.
Alexandra, we have lots of people saying great sound, and so we're ready to go. Please proceed.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Doug. I also want to make sure that we just a few learning protocols that we share that as we go through this afternoon. We are hoping for continuous interaction, and so that chat function in the GoTo webinar platform itself, please feel free to add questions, add comments, ideas as we go through today so that it's a continuous dialogue. We're hoping that this is a safe place for challenge and for your questions truly to be answered during the course of this afternoon. So what are the guiding questions that are going to be driving us today? We're really going to start with what should we know about language learners and how do they learn another language? There's two questions that I hear all the time in schools across the country. I hear my students speaking English all the time. Shouldn't they just exit the program? And what is academic language and how is that different from social language or what I hear being spoken in school all the time? We're then going to turn to really thinking about how we utilize data-driven instruction around those academic language demands in order to make sure our students are able to access and achieve content standards and grade level expectations. And finally, we're going to think about what is the research around daily language supports that are most effective for language learners. Okay. I'd like to start with this quote by Einstein. If I had only 1 hour to save the world, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and only 5 minutes finding the solution. And so that's really what I want to start us off with today. I don't see language learners as a problem. I really think that culturally and linguistically diverse students add so much depth, culture, and variety to our schools and allows us to learn from one another in a way that helps us be prepared for the 21st century world as it exists. And the population of this group of students is growing. It's growing in size, it's growing in prevalence, Before, it was something that mostly large school districts needed to really worry about, if you will. And now it's really prevalent in rural communities, suburban communities, urban communities, small and large districts. And the reality is that the number of languages that our schools are serving has diversified immensely.
I'm sorry, Alexandra, I need to interrupt you because your slides aren't showing. Would you please click on sharing and make sure that you click on show my screen, because that way everybody can see your slides.
Well, let's see.
It's in the, just click on sharing and then hit show my screen.
Sharing. Okay.
There we go. It says now viewing Alexandra's screen. Thank you very much.
Okay, I apologize for that.
No, that was my fault. I should have prompted you for that. But thanks to Rick Rowe, my good friend, and several other people, they reminded me to have you do that. So I'm sorry. Please, I didn't mean to interrupt, but please proceed.
Thank you. So right now, schools are really facing a challenge of serving, in some cases, up to over 100 languages in one school district, meaning that we have to be, as educators, much more prepared now more than ever to serve all of the linguistic differences and the cultural differences that this body of students bring. Ultimately, the growth is not going to be changing. The trajectories now sit at around 2030. We are projected at having about 40% of our student population being language learners. And that carries great implications. The reality is that most of the students, most of that 40% of language learners will not be recent immigrants. Most of that 40% that's being projected for the year 2030 will be US born students that are first generation, that are born in homes where their mother and or father or their guardian is speaking a language other than English. And right now, the research is showing us that most US schools are currently undereducating this group of students, which will represent close to half of the student population for the US. Now, this is research that's coming out of the National Study of School Effectiveness for Language Minority Students' Long-Term Academic Achievement, which came out of a 2002 Thomas and Collier research report. Now, there's a range of program models that exist in the US. And I get questions about this all the time. Is there a program that works best? We have transitional bilingual education. We have transitional program of instruction that sometimes is called push in. We have sometimes call it push out or pull out. We have sheltered instruction, dual language instruction, one way, two way, heritage language, sink or swim. It's enough to dizzy even the best educator with the best of intentions. And the reality is that the research shows that there are two that are most effective. And I highlighted them on the screen. The first is transitional bilingual education, and the second is dual language instruction. Now, the focus of today is not to really dive into these particular program models, but I think it'll be clear as we think about how language is acquired for language learners, why these two program models really stand out. I will tell you also that the research shows that there is one program model that is least effective for language learners, and that's what we call the transitional program of instruction or pull-out services. And what research is showing us is that English learners that are sort of immersed into this English mainstream especially because of parent refusals or because they're just pulled out for maybe 30 minutes of service a day, shows the largest decrease in reading and math achievement, particularly by grade 5. and they represent the largest number of dropouts of all of the language learners sort of subpopulation. And so we know that this is the least effective model, and yet by necessity, I know that there are a lot of schools that this is the program structure that they have. And so we have to look and see what other implications does this have in terms of the type of instruction that we provide for our students. And so I want to pause for just a moment here. And think about how many of us hear this conversation of the service or the program model. How many of us really talk about English learner or language learner supports in terms of, I have to provide them with 30 minutes of service or 60 minutes of service or 90 minutes of service?
And Alexandra, if I could just offer some comments from the field of our friends who are listening, they are bound by minutes and by time. But what do you do when that's what sounded like a good idea in September, and here we are in March, and it's clearly not enough? How do you make mid-course corrections on service delivery?
Thank you so much, Doug, for asking that question. I think the reality is, in the beginning of the year, when we are engaged in the process of scheduling our students and making sure that our staff is allocated correctly, I think a focus on services and programs is a necessity. However, after that initial phase of the year where we're thinking about scheduling, it has to be an increase on the quality of instruction. That needs to be where we focus. So if it's 30 minutes of service that they're receiving, then we have to really begin to ask ourselves, what is the quality of service? What is the quality of instruction that's taking place during those 30 minutes? And what's the quality of support that's taking place in the other 5.5 hours of instruction that student will be sitting through during the course of that day? Because 30 minutes of instruction and 30 minutes of support definitely is not going to be enough to sustain that learner and ensure that they are achieving academically as well as growing in their language proficiency. So I think this begs the question, like, how does language develop? First and foremost, this came out of WIDA. Many of us know WIDA is out of Wisconsin, and they are the designers of one of the language proficiency tests for English language learners. And it's a test that's taken once a year. It's used in 30-something states across the country. And they also have a number of tools that guide the language acquisition process, and these 10 principles really do drive the way language develops and the way language learners should be supported across the school day, regardless of whether they're with a language specialist and regardless of whether they're in the general education classroom. And so first and foremost is that students' language and cultures are valuable resources to be tapped into and incorporated. This really thinks about background knowledge and the reality that as human beings, we are wired to make connections to what we already know. And the more we are able to support students in their ability to make connections to what they linguistically know and know from their prior experience, the better they'll be able to access new content. The second principle is that students' home, school, and communities really do influence their language development. Number 3 is that students draw on their metacognitive, metalinguistic, and metacultural awareness to develop proficiency in additional languages. That basically means that if we don't ever have an opportunity to think about how we use language, why we use language, why we use language differently in the playground versus in the classroom versus at home, then we never have an opportunity to explore what those differences are and understand what those differences are. All too often, we take for granted that students know the rules of how language is used. And unfortunately, that's just not the case. In particular, it comes up with different grammatical structures and especially vocabulary, when, especially for Spanish-speaking students, they have the possibility of accessing tens of thousands of words through cognates, and yet unless they ever receive explicit instruction in identifying cognates and what to do once they identify them, it's tens of thousands of words that they'll never know to sort of process in that way. The fourth principle is that students' academic language develops in their native language facilitates their academic language development in English. Conversely, academic language developed in English informs their academic development in their native language. And so there's this play between what my first language is and what my second language is. And what I learn in either one supports my development in the other, both in terms of content as well as in language. The fifth principle is one of the most important to me, and that is that students learn language through meaningful use and interaction. I tell all of the schools and districts with whom I work, a classroom with language learners that is silent is a classroom of language learners that I'm sure will not be achieving successfully, because they must be immersed in opportunities to read, write, listen, and speak continuously in authentic ways, in engaging ways that allows them to meaningfully use language to access the content as well as to socialize. The sixth principle is that students use language in functional and communicative ways that depends on the context. And so sometimes students fool us into thinking that they speak a ton of English because we hear them on the playground, we hear them in the hallways, we hear them in different contexts being able to communicate effectively. And yet that is a different register. It is a different context that doesn't require both a linguistic demand as well as a cognitive demand. And once both of those things are more demanding than what their language can produce, we definitely begin to see discrepancies in terms of students' performance. Number 7 is that students develop language proficiency in listening, speaking, reading, and writing interdependently, but at different rates and in different ways. This is the focus of the data-driven instruction piece that we'll really be diving into later this afternoon, because many schools that I work with, they know about students' composite scores. That is the sort of one overall encompassing score that defines the language proficiency of their students. And yet teachers and educators are not diving into what are the sub-scores of each of those language demands, and what does that mean in terms of the instructional planning process, and how do we make sure that we are honoring the different rates that each of those domains are developing. Number 8 is that students develop academic language and academic competence as interrelated processes. And so obviously, if the more English I know, the easier it will be for me to show mastery of the content standards. The less English I know, the more challenging it's going to be for me to show you what I know in terms of a science standard or a social studies standards or a math standard, whatever the case may be. Number 9 is that students develop social and instructional academic language is a complex and long-term process, and it's their foundation for their success in school. And so it is a long-term process. Please know that it can't be something that happens 30 minutes a day and is the responsibility of a specialist that pulls them out during a service that's disconnected from the instructional program that happens throughout the building. It must be something that is embedded into every single classroom, every single grade level, and is a shared ownership because it is a very complex and long-term process. And finally, students' access to instructional tasks requiring complex thinking is enhanced when linguistic complexity and instructional supports match the levels of language proficiency. And so this is really where we're going to start diving into the content, because if we know that listening, speaking, reading, and writing develop at different rates, and we know that the instructional tasks must be aligned and really enhanced with the appropriate linguistic complexity and instructional supports, then we need to know how to make that match a reality. Okay. But before we do that, I want to take time to open up the chat box. Having listened to and having seen those 10 principles, 2 guiding questions. Does your program model follow these principles? What implication do these principles have, or does this have, on the type of instruction that you would expect to see regardless of the program model?
So Alexandra, we're already starting to get some questions in. First of all, I want to assure everybody you can get copies of the slides. In fact, not just the slides, but Alexandra's commentary on those. The entire video and audio will be available as a free download. We'll have that probably within about an hour after this webinar is over. So let's start out with responding directly to some of the things that you have proposed to us. And in the anonymity of the webinar, we can talk very openly about some tension that I see between classrooms, buildings, and central offices. And that is, I know my students need more help, but we're bound to the schedule that we have. How do we break out of that?
That's a really great question, and it's one that's very common. So the reality is that human resources, right, staffing models are allocated based on service minutes, proficiency levels, and the demographics and the needs of the population. So that cannot change, right? What needs to change ultimately is the role of gen ed teachers in the language acquisition process and the supports that entire buildings are provided in order to build the expertise of gen ed teachers to continue on providing appropriate scaffolds and appropriate instructional supports when those students are not receiving their service minutes, quote unquote, if you will, with a specialist. And that's just until we have a different allocation model for how districts build supports for language learners, we have to shift the expertise of all teachers to be able to provide these services.
And I might add, Alexandra, to the administrators who are joining us, that if you're on the fence, there's never just right. You have to consider the risks of there's either too little intervention or too much intervention. I've never heard anybody complain about too much intervention. And so if you need, in the middle of the year right now, to add extra minutes, there's far less risk in doing that than there is in having not enough, even though that might have seemed adequate in September. Here's another comment from one of our participants, Alexandra. With our ELLs, we're finding the more collaborative questioning and interaction, the better all learners become. So it's not just about ELL learners, it helps everybody. In fact, what is good ELL instruction is just plain good instruction.
So, and there's an ongoing discourse in the international community of this is good instruction for all. And so, yes, some of the strategies, some of the scaffolds definitely are beneficial to all learners. But what we have to understand is that these are absolutely essential for language learners to even be able to access the content in order to have an equitable educational experience. And so that's where we really have to think about shifting the ownership from the few specialists, particularly in small rural districts that are having sort of the number of ELLs that are now part of their demographics exploding, where there's now one ELL specialist, right? To that one ELL specialist to the building being the one that's owning the responsibility for providing high quality instructional supports.
Here's one more really insightful idea from one of our participants, and that is maybe the focus should be authentic to the student rather than authentic to the standards. You know, I've never heard it phrased that way, but that is a really thoughtful comment and something that makes me think, again, that's not just appropriate for ELLs, but for all students. So thanks for that insight. What do you think, Alexandra?
Thank you very much. I have a blog that I do, and that was the nature of one of my recent posts. And that is, until you understand who the student is and what it means to be culturally relevant and honor that student's identity, it's a very, very difficult climb to help that student to achieve a standard. Because there are already so many other things that they're trying to assimilate to and trying to understand.
Well, we're going to have to move on. Lots of really great insights and questions, but I want to make sure that we respect everybody's time and finish in about 15 minutes. So let's continue.
Thank you very much. So we addressed this a little bit before, and that is, I hear my students speaking English all the time. You know, shouldn't they just exit the program? Well, language acquisition is a very long-term process. It takes 3 years for students to acquire social language. And by social language, we're really talking about the language that students use in the playground, in sports, in clubs, in the hallways, in the cafeteria. And it takes about 5 to 7 years to acquire academic language. Now, here's the kicker. That 5 to 7 year study is based on students receiving uninterrupted, high quality instruction during the course of that time. Now, what does that, excuse me, what does that then mean? Apologies. High quality instruction in academic language first requires that we understand the difference between social and academic language, right? There are 3 levels of academic language. One is the word level. This is by far one of the things that we notice a great deal when we encounter language learners, right? There's a lack of vocabulary, there's a lack of phrase, there's a lot of misconceptions in terms of words with multiple meanings. As a language learner myself, I have been speaking English for decades, and I still struggle at times with idioms and words with multiple meanings. The next piece is sentence level academic language. And that's the structures and the conventions, the mechanics of language, right? What does it mean to put together a sentence that is grammatically correct according to English norms? This is especially challenging for students that speak another language that have very different grammatical conventions. For example, if I were speaking in Spanish, I might say the car blew. And if I'm directly translating in my head, that might be what I write in English, which is what many of my Spanish-speaking students do when they're writing in English. And yet they have to have an opportunity to learn what the grammatical conventions are and the sentence level structures are for English academic language. Finally, there's discourse level academic levels of complexity. And that is the quantity, variety, and style of discourse. One of the things that is really challenging for teachers across the country is to think about stylistically and culturally what are the different ways that discourse exists across the world. For many countries, the narrative structure that we have an introduction and then we sequentially build on some key events in order, and then there's a conclusion. That's just not the way discourse is developed across the world. And so we have to explicitly understand what that structure is and be prepared to support students in their ability to orally and in writing be able to produce and understand this language of school. Now, all of this academic language is assessed once a year for every single language learner. Now, I live in Chicago. Most of my teaching, as well as my principalship, as well as being a director, happened in Chicago public schools. We were an access state. There's also ELPA 21, LPAC, TELPAs, the New York CSLAT. There's a number of different language proficiency assessments, but ultimately they're all an assessment that's taken once a year to determine the academic proficiency levels across the 4 domains of academic language. Now, there's the listening and speaking, which comprises the oracy, and then there's the reading and writing that comprises print literacy or comprehension. All of those 4 scores are rolled up into a composite score. One of the things that I encourage all educators to do is not to be fooled by the composite score. That composite score simply means that on average, across all 4 domains, this is the average numerical value of all 4 of those scores. But we know that receptive language and productive language develop at very, very different paces. By that I mean that what I can understand, what you tell me, is much different, is probably much higher than what I can produce in speaking. Equivalently, what I can understand orally, speaking and listening, is probably much higher than what I can produce in print literacy. And so I encourage us to know each of the 4 domains. If we are going to truly honor data-driven instruction, it begins by knowing the score for each of our students, regardless of what our state assessment is, across each of those 4 domains.
So Alexandra, let me interject because we have a number of our participants with questions. And one of the things that I think is really important, because I also taught language learning students, is that we got to be careful in looking at the slide that it's not a linear progression, that writing is at the very end. In fact, writing is what helps to improve listening. Writing is what helps to improve reading. So it's, you know, if we could have a visual here, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's really circular, and all those things go together.
They are.
Sometimes for our ELL students, we greatly undervalue writing. It's a real key to improve listening and reading. Here's some comments from our readers or our participants. In a low incidence middle school district, how reasonable is it for beginning level English language learners with low literacy to participate in classrooms with 28 students who are expanding such demanding curriculum and dealing with characters like To Kill a Mockingbird or challenges in upholding a Bill of Rights? In other words, there's the complexity of the language as well as the complexity of ideas. How do you reconcile that with the needs of ELL students?
So I think that definitely requires additional conversation because there's multiple layers of challenges there. Number one is that there is low incidence of ELLs, and so that probably means that there's lower number of resources to support that students. Number two is we have texts that are being utilized that are not only linguistically quite complex, like To Kill a Mockingbird, but they also are grounded in some historical challenges, right? That if you don't know the history of this country or the history of the period that's being talked about, then there's not only a cultural divide, but also sort of a prior knowledge divide that student may not realistically be able to overcome within the time allotted within that unit in the gen ed classroom. So there's a number of different pieces, not just from the program model, but also from the resources and how tied to that textbook, or not textbook, excuse me, tied to that novel is the curriculum, or is that the vehicle for some other learning? And then the student could use a different text to access the standards or access the unit that's being taught in that classroom.
So, Alexandra, several people picked up on your research on the 5 to 7 years for academic discourse, and yet they're saying, but our requirement is that students exit after 4 years. There appears to be a divergence between what you said the research says for academic discourse and what their requirements are to exit after 4 years.
So this is one of the reasons why I add that, and we start with the program model, because there is a big push in a lot of different states and a lot of different districts to do an early exit model, and that 4 year is that early exit model, and the research does not support that is effective for students in terms of long-term research, long-term outcomes for students. They are not seeing the long-term benefits, academic achievement, and sustainability of student learning over time with those models.
I guess the last thing, and then I need to let you go on because we've got to conclude, is pulling kids out of English language arts classes to get ELL is a zero-sum game. It's got to be added, not subtracted from their English language literacy requirements. And so I want to be very practical with our listeners here. What does that mean? So where does that time come from? Because they've also got to take math tests. They've also got to take other subject classes. The honest answer is, if you're going to create more time for ELL as well as for, let's face it, non-ELL students who need more time to read and need more time to write, it means less time on other subjects. And I think the acid test here is what I've called power standards. That is that small subset of standards, not frantically covering every social studies and every science standards, but a few things that will have kids ready. And if you ask your high school colleagues, they're not going to say, send me more kids who know every detail of every elementary and middle school standard. They'll say, send me kids who can read the high school textbook. So it does involve making the statement that is very unpopular. You spend more time on some things like English language literacy and less time on other things. So I just think we need to be honest about that. So I'm sorry to intervene, Alexandra. I know you've got more stuff to do, so let's charge ahead.
Absolutely, and I also want to just put a plug in that one of the things that schools really must begin to consider is having ELL specialists in resource personnel at planning meetings, grade level planning meetings, data meetings, because part of what needs to take place is not just we pull out kids and expect that we're going to solve everything. The reality is that pull-out is the least effective model of all models of language program support. So we have to be able to match what the language specialists know with gen ed teachers so that during the ELA block, ELA teachers know what scaffolds and instructional supports can be put in place. And then the language teacher, the language specialist can continue providing additional intensive services and ELD support during the time that they're with the student. So moving forward, I want to make sure that everybody understands when you have your language proficiency test, ultimately that numerical value, and I haven't included all of the information here, but just an idea of some of this. That numerical value equates to the type of language or the degree of complexity that a student can produce. So if you have students that scored in a 1 to a 1.9, that means that their language development in English is equivalent to them being able to process, pick, and utilize pictorial and or graphic representations of language, and or one-word responses and one-word inputs. That's really in terms of comprehensibility where their linguistic complexity and linguistic proficiency exists. When they are beginning, they're able to interpret, understand, manipulate phrases, short sentences, of oral and written language, but it's going to still contain many errors that often impede meaning, right? So we're still going to have to embed a great deal of instructional supports, scaffolding, all of those visuals, et cetera, et cetera. As these numbers begin to rise, the amount of linguistic complexity that students are able to both understand, manipulate, and utilize begins to develop. And so one of the things that we have to be really mindful of is that when we are engaging in data-driven instruction for ELs, the very first question when I was a principal is, okay, this is your instructional task. What's the language proficiency level of your students? And let me see how you've scaffolded this task. Because if it's an essay, I know that a student that's in terms of reading and writing at a level 1 or a level 2 is not going to be able to produce 5-paragraph essays in the same way that a student that's performing at a level 4 or a 5 will be able to do. When we look at this in the WIDA, and I'm just going to go through this very quickly, I utilize WIDA again because the majority of states do utilize the WIDA as their language proficiency assessment. When we look at this through the WIDA, it shows us all 3 of those layers of language complexity, from the word level to the sentence level and the discourse level. What are some of the general and specific language of the content areas? What type of expanded sentences should we be expecting, and the type of discourse that we should be expecting from students. And they always align it to what that proficiency score is for each student in each domain. What is the implication of this then in terms of instruction? Number 1, it should be utilized by every teacher. Again, not just by the language specialist, but by every gen ed specials, whether it's music or gym or art or whatever the case may be. All educators in the building should be utilizing this data to inform the inputs, and that is what scaffolds will the teacher need to use to make the lesson comprehensible based on the amount of language students currently have and based on students' cultural reference points. The second piece is, if this is the amount of language and this is my student's cultural reference point, then how can the learning task be differentiated to allow students to interact with grade level learning through texts and tasks that they can understand, and by producing work that is not over the language skills that they currently have? And so it's a twofold scenario in terms of how teachers and educators should be expected to utilize this data. One is to design lessons that really take the level of linguistic complexity of the texts and tasks that they're planning for, but also really thinking about what is the level of language and the linguistic complexity that I should be expecting from my students in return, and how am I going to try to minimize the impact of language proficiency on my ability to understand what it is that students have learned from this unit. So in essence, the language scaffolds are how students will access the standard. Differentiation is when and how each learner will show mastery of that standard. And finally, the content standard is what students will learn. We're not asking students to learn something different. All language learners must have access, equitable access to grade level learning. It's not a service, that is their right. But the means we use to get them there must be different, because these students are linguistically and culturally diverse. In other words, the language development of students across each domain determines the scaffolding and the context that students need to be successful in every academic setting. And this is in every academic setting once again. So this removes this idea of pull out is the only one responsible for ensuring the academic success of our language learners. This must be across all academic settings within a school building. I want to pause here also because we all know that there's an affective filter, right? That for students to explore language, for students to want to utilize language while they're learning it, requires a certain amount of trust and a certain degree of relationship building. And yet, I am encountering across the country many educators that want to love their way into student success. And so I'm asking us to be more strategic in how we scaffold and provide context to really align with the language proficiency and the needs of students, rather than providing blanket supports that some students may not need and actually may be serving as a crutch to the development of our linguistically diverse students. This then means that scaffolds are temporary supports, and they are removed as teachers observe evidence of increased academic language, and that scaffold should be strategically and gradually removed to allow for language growth and more extended interactions with content. There are some prerequisites to this being a reality and being a possibility. And one of it came from the field already, and that is number one, that teachers must know their students and their language abilities. I put students first because there is an element of identity and culture that all educators must understand. We must know our students' data, but students are not simply a data point. When language learners come into the classroom, come into a US school, whether they are born in another country or born in the US, they come with a great deal of cultural differences that must be understood by all educators in order to help them meet their full potential. Teachers must take the time to continually reinforce strong relationships with students and their family to encourage language risk-taking and language use. And that's that affective filter that we were talking about before. All teachers have to have time to collaborate and time to analyze data, to discover trends, to identify instructional supports needed, to plan for the instruction of grade level learning targets, and to monitor progress towards those goals. If we don't have collaborative time across gen ed and ELL specialists within the building, or dual language specialists within the building, we are setting our teachers and our students up for failure. All teachers, ESL, gen ed, special ed, specials, reading specialists, dual language, bilingual, everybody must be able to know and apply daily scaffolds to ensure access to grade level standards and grade level rigorous thinking. There's a huge body of research around the cognitive benefits of being bilingual. And yet if we don't understand what the strategies are to help engage students in rigorous thinking, we will not help students realize the cognitive benefits that are inherent in their very bilingualism. And finally, we have to have curriculum materials and classroom norms that honor the cultures, norms, and funds of knowledge of the students being served by these classrooms. A note on collaborative time, and I think we've talked about this a little bit already, and that is that we have to remember as schools that we may have very small programs, but even if you have one ESL specialist or one dual language specialist, we have to remember that they are language specialists that are required to apply psycholinguistic theories and principles based on and related to second language acquisition every single day. So they're not just second language teachers or literacy teachers, they should be tapped into as resources. And that's at the halfway point. If there's something that you can do, I would say, how do you organize that person's schedule so that they can be accessible to the building and be accessible to struggling grade level teams, so that they can help embed some of those strategies into classroom instruction on a daily basis. Finally, what are some, because we're running out of time, an hour flies by so quickly, some evidence-based practices for ELLs. First and foremost is that ELLs have to have opportunities to develop academic language through literacy and content areas. And we've talked about this a couple of times, but I cannot emphasize this point enough. Language acquisition is something that happens across the entire instructional day, from the moment that students walk into the door to the moment they leave. It is everybody's charge to ensure that they are successful and that those strategies, critical strategies, are embedded in every content area. Vocabulary should be emphasized across all content area, because it's something that can be a quick win for both students as well as teachers across every grade level. Allow students' first language to support access to the content and the development of the second language as needed. For students who are at a level 1 or level 2 especially, this is very important. Allow them to engage in bilingual notes or translated pieces, because being able to see that in their native language will help not only them to make the connections to English, but also to reinforce the content learning in a language that they already feel comfortable in. Providing clear content objectives and language objectives that reflect the learning across both components is absolutely critical. And so in most schools, educators are already required to post, communicate, make sure students are keenly aware of what the objective of the learning is. If there's language learners, it should also be very clear what the language objective is and how does that language objective align to the language levels that they have. Some effective supports. The reality is that there are a range of supports, and the supports are only effective in so much as they align to the linguistic need based on the language, the linguistic development of each language learner. And so there's 3 different basic types of supports. There's sensory, graphic, or interactive. Some of the supports that have been found most effective is explicit instruction, particularly around that metalinguistic awareness that we talked about in the beginning, building background knowledge and leveraging prior knowledge, frequent use of language, whether it's language structures or content vocabulary, regular and intentionally designed academic discussions. I cannot emphasize enough how important academic and accountable talk is to students being able to connect mini lessons and the instruction to what application they're able to take to whatever task they're going to be able to do. The use of visuals, modeling success and correct responses, and then 2 pieces that should be staples in every classroom are sentence stems and or frames, which is where you give students sort of the beginning, the start of a sentence that will anchor the academic language for that discourse, whether it's to have a conversation with a turn and talk partner or a sentence starter to begin a paper. It anchors that sentence, anchors that discourse in the academic language of that content. And the second staple that should be part of every classroom are graphic organizers. And the graphic organizers should help students to focus on the thinking by providing an organizational structure for their language use. In the end, we have to realize that any lesson, activity, or test that employs language is in part a measure of students' language skills. And so this is of particular concern for tests and tasks for learners whose first language is not the language of the test or task. And therefore, it's important to consider the language background in developing, selecting, and administering tests and tasks and interpreting students' performance. And that came out of the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, the American Educational Research Association, an American Psychological Association, and National Association on Measurement and Education out of 1999. And so all educators must build their expertise and willingness to minimize the impact of language on lessons, tasks, and assessment by analyzing the language demands of classroom instruction and adapting the learning tools to align to the language demands in order to increase student success.
Well, Alexandra, I really appreciate all of the wisdom that you've shared today. And I can tell you that as a math teacher, what you've said really resonates with me. And I had a lot of English language learners as my students, and I really had to separate what's math and what's English language literacy with numbers in it. And so what you talked about in terms of incorporating this into the content areas really resonated with me as a math teacher. And I think we would find the same in science and social studies. I'm afraid that we've run out of time, and I do want to encourage everyone to note Alexandra's email there, and also we will post at creativeleadership.net all of the videos, including today's videos. You'll find free research and free videos, free articles, lots of ways to help you. And Alexandra and I are also more than willing to have one-to-one conversations with all of you to see how we can collaborate with you and your school and your system to improve opportunities for English language learners. Alexandra, thank you so much for all this great wisdom today. I really appreciate your sharing it.
Thank you so much, Doug, and thank you everybody for your participation. Please don't hesitate to reach out via email or phone. I have a number of resources that I'm more than happy to share with anybody that shoots me an email, and I look forward to continued dialogue.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.